When I ask you to think of Europe, what cities do you think of? For the average person, it's Paris, London, Barcelona, Rome, and that kind of vibe. Very few would think of places such as Belgrade, Sofia, Chisinau, or Minsk. What this reflects is a distinct separation between the states of Western Europe and the states of Eastern Europe. This is a separation which has existed since the end of the Second World War, where the continent of Europe was completely ideologically divided between the authoritarian, socialist, and communist states of Eastern Europe and the democratic, capitalist states of Western Europe. This division was best summarized by the term Iron Curtain, which was created by former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. At its peak, the Iron Curtain ran along these borders here. During the period of the Cold War, the Iron Curtain, whilst not physically existing, without a doubt existed in people's minds. There was very limited correspondence and active engagement between the two sides. Those from Western Europe very rarely ventured into the Red East, and those from the East were urged to stay away from the corrupt West. Economically in this period, the states of Western Europe developed far beyond their authoritarian socialist counterparts, as their fundamentally capitalist ideologies moved many states towards privatization initiatives, and many individuals strived to make as much money as they could. Alternatively, in Eastern Europe, the Marxist mindset, which steered its many states, dictated that it was equality which created a successful society. Now, we all know that this ideology was often not one shared by government officials, as many scenarios of embezzlement and corruption have now been revealed to the world from this period. However, many people nonetheless were forced to live under such regimes which taught such ideologies, and therefore did not have the opportunities to individually financially better themselves. Looking after the state was seen as looking after yourself. And you see, this is a point reflected by the main industries which dominated Eastern Europe's supposed socialist paradises. Next to all of their relative economies were primarily driven by the export of raw materials, agriculture produce, and low-quality consumer goods. Such export industries also existed in Western Europe. However, they had extremely desirable technology, financial and legal-based exports, amongst many other areas which were increasingly valuable in global society. The combination of all of these factors meant that in the period between 1989 and 1991, which is also the time frame marked by the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, there was not a single Eastern European state, excluding the Soviet Union, in the top 10 most economically powerful European states. In fact, the map looked like this. You can clearly see the disparity between annual GDP in Western European and Eastern European states. But, as I said, between 1989 and 1991, authoritarian socialism collapsed as the domineering ideology of Eastern Europe, and by 1992, the only technically socialist state left in Europe was Yugoslavia. Eastern Europe was now free to play capitalist catch-up with its Western counterparts and close the economic gulf which had opened between the two. Now, in theory, the fall of communism should have kick-started such a process, but in actuality, it hasn't really altered the economic landscape of the European continent at all. Look at this map of Europe from 2023, which demonstrates the wealth of the countries in Europe in 4 percentiles. In green, we see the high percentile. In yellow, we see the middle to high percentile. In orange, the middle to low percentile. And in red, the lowest percentile. Now, I'm sure you can all see what this map is demonstrating. But just to really emphasize it, let's add the outline of what was the Iron Curtain. You can see clearly that since the 1989 to 1991 period, not a significant amount has actually changed in the economic rankings of the continent. I mean, yeah, certain states such as Poland and Romania have significantly economically developed since their relative socialist periods. However, the Western states have also continuously economically developed and continue to dominate the highest percentile of economic significance in Europe. There's really been no economic catch-up. In fact, since the end of the socialist era, the gap between the bottom and top percentiles has only increased. Germany sits at the top with a GDP of around $4 trillion. Whilst at the other end of the spectrum, there's Montenegro, who have a rough GDP of $5 billion. Now, obviously this is an unfair comparison. GDP doesn't give you everything you need to know about the economic and social welfare of states, and the population size must also be taken into account. However, this doesn't change the picture at all for Eastern Europe. In fact, it only makes things worse. If we map the states with the lowest GNI per capita, which is essentially a measure of average annual income, these are the states which come out worse, and these are the states which come out best. Again, the East-West divide is extremely evident, and no matter which way you try to spin it, there is certainly no argument that there is equality between the two sides. Despite the aspirations which came following the collapse of the Iron Curtain, Eastern Europe still economically lags far behind Western Europe. The question then is why? Why is this the case, and why haven't Eastern European states been able to close this gap or create generally more prosperous opportunities for their populations? Well, like most things related to international relations, there's not one simple answer, but rather there are multiple factors which can be utilized and applied to explain why the situation has come to be. The first of these is the lasting influence that the communist era has had over the states which constitute Eastern Europe. Let's call it the communist hangover. It's hard to fully emphasize how significant the impact of the communist period has been on both the economic output and governance of many Eastern European states. In fact, even in Germany, the richest EU country, we still see it in the divide between the East and the West. The doctrine of communism bred economic inefficiency in the region, which is carried on in many cases. You have to remember that in the West, the ways of capitalism and free market economics have been embedded in society for centuries in some cases. So from the outside looking in, it's quite easy for many who come from this background to see just why many Eastern European states are economically inefficient. But it must be remembered that for around a 50-year period between roughly 1940 and 1990, practically all Eastern Europeans were born and raised into societies where capitalism was a very foreign concept. This is perhaps best emphasized by the stories of shares in state companies, which would become immensely valuable, being traded for vegetables by many across Eastern Europe in the early days of the attempt to transition to free market capitalism. Many in Eastern Europe still haven't fully got to grips with the system of liberal capitalism, which is why many of the economies in this region have continuously remained inefficient, and in numerous cases have failed to significantly diversify. Those Eastern European states which have managed to develop economically, such as Poland, the Czech Republic, and Romania, have all been assisted massively by joining the EU, which is now a shared aspiration of many Eastern European states. However, to join the EU, strict criteria must be met. Part of this criteria is the demonstration of low levels of corruption, which, unfortunately for Eastern Europe, is another significant component of the communist hangover. As you can see from this map, the top 10 most corrupt states in Europe are all in the East, beyond the old boundary of the Iron Curtain. Corruption plays a huge part in explaining why Eastern Europe economically lags far behind Western Europe, as often state finances are embezzled or entirely misappropriated at the expense of the general populace and economic development. And no guys, I'm not saying the West is free of corruption, it's there heavily as well. Now, if you've made it this far into the video, congrats, as I'm sure some people who didn't will say that I forgot to mention these next 2 points, but that is geography and colonization. These two factors are actually pretty intertwined, as their geography is one of the reasons that they couldn't participate in colonialism. Historically, once Western European countries established trade and colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, they gained tremendous wealth and power. Meanwhile, Eastern Europe had way less access to ocean trade routes than Western Europe, so they couldn't trade as much. Centuries ago, having a port could mean the difference between being a global powerhouse or another territory for a bigger empire. There's a reason why some of the biggest cities in the world to this day are all near the water and have a port of some kind. Peter the Great is a good example of just how important this is. When he came to power, he spent the majority of his 43-year rule trying to find access to a warm water port to boost the Russian economy. That was the major reason for the Great Northern War with the Swedish Empire in the 18th century, where Russia gained significant territories along the Baltic coast, including Estonia, Livonia, and Ingria. This allowed Peter to establish St. Petersburg in 1703 on the newly acquired coastline, which he made the new capital of Russia. It was also the major reason for the Russo-Turkish War against the Ottoman Empire to gain access to the Black Sea. However, that one wasn't really successful. Anyways, you can see the importance of having access to an ocean and not being landlocked. And even though some of these countries weren't, it didn't mean they couldn't take advantage of it. Unlike countries like the UK and France, who had immediate access to the Atlantic Ocean, if countries in the East wanted to make it out there, they had to deal with heavy tolls or restricted access from the Danish Straits. It's the same issue with the Strait of Gibraltar back then, which has been ruled historically by Muslims, the Spanish, and now Britain. For these reasons, Eastern Europe couldn't participate in international trade and participate in colonialism, which was a massive disadvantage. And even today, they don't benefit from neo-colonialism like some Western European countries still do. And of course, the other side to this geography issue is that much of Eastern Europe, especially Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine, is extremely flat. Now, this is great for producing food, but it makes it easy for invading armies to attack, making one of the reasons the region was always in the middle of conflict and invading armies from all over the place, not just Europe. Now, don't get me wrong, Eastern Europe has far from the worst geography in the world, but combined with other factors, these geographical limitations add to the reason this region is poorer than their Western counterparts. This cannot be understated enough, especially when talking about this problem historically and not just within the past few decades. Talking about conflict though, Another significant factor to explain the economic disparity is the constant wars. Believe it or not, war is usually remarkably unhelpful for a state trying to develop its economy and the wealth of its population. And since 1991, basically all conflicts on the European continent have been located in Eastern Europe. These various conflicts have not only directly impacted the economies of their respective territories, but have also indirectly impacted them through the effect that conflict has had on immigration rates from Eastern European states. During the wars which came as a result of the collapse of Yugoslavia, millions of people from across the Balkans left their respective homelands, depriving them of many future generations and future workforce. The relationship between conflict and immigration can be witnessed to this very day, as the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine has had a severe impact on both of their populations, which will likely have a huge economic impact in the future due to the brain drain. I mean, in 2022 alone, it's estimated that around 12,000 millionaires left Russia, as well as almost 100,000 tech workers, or 10% of the country's entire tech workforce. And this leads me to the final point, the simple opportunity. Due to there no longer being an iron curtain, many in Eastern Europe have sought jobs in more economically prosperous regions than their own, where they can get paid more. People follow the money, and we can see this playing out. We are now over 30 years on from the Cold War and the period of the Iron Curtain, and it is clear that Eastern Europe has not economically caught up with Western Europe. Should more Eastern European states start to commit to joining the EU, they may finally kick the trends which have remained from the communist period, and may become more opportunity-filled. However, if the day was to ever come where Eastern and Western Europe are on economic and social parity, it would be a long, long way into the future. Thank you for watching.